What if I told you that one of the greatest feasts in human history, a hall filled with 300 warriors, thick with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, was cooked without a single metal pot, not one pan, not one iron cauldron? You might picture scorched bones and ash, primitive, desperate, but you would be completely wrong. Archaeologists excavating the Great Longhouse at Borg in northern Norway, one of the largest Viking Age structures ever discovered, found evidence of massive feasting events. And in the cooking areas, no metal cookware, only stone, fire, and the hands of people who understood both better than we ever will. What you are about to learn will not just change how you see the Vikings, it will change how you see the relationship between human intelligence and the natural world. Stay until the end of this video, because what begins as a story about cooking will become something far deeper. A story about power, about survival, about a philosophy of life that turns scarcity into mastery. Every technique you are about to see has been verified through archaeological evidence or experimental archaeology. Where the historical record is incomplete, we will tell you so. No myths dressed as facts, only the real Viking way. For a Viking, a feast was never just food. It was the center of the entire social universe. The Jarl, the chieftain, did not prove his right to lead through words alone. He proved it through what he placed on the table. Every cut of meat, every steaming bowl, carried a message louder than any sword. I can provide. I can protect. Follow me. Warriors sitting at those long oak tables were not simply eating. They were renewing a contract. Loyalty in exchange for abundance. Respect in exchange for generosity. A poor feast was not an embarrassment. It was a political crisis. And feeding 300 men, without a single metal vessel, required not just skill, it required a mastery of nature so complete that it looked, to outsiders, like magic. So how did they do it? The answer begins not in the kitchen, it begins beneath your feet. Before a single piece of meat was prepared, before any fire was lit, the Vikings made a decision that could mean the difference between a perfect feast and a deadly explosion. They chose their stones. This sounds simple. It was not. A stone collected from the riverbank, smooth, beautiful, seemingly perfect, contains trapped moisture deep within its porous structure. Place that stone into a fire hot enough to cook an ox, and the water inside expands faster than the rock can release it. The stone does not crack, it shatters. Like a grenade, at close range. Viking cooks knew this, not from textbooks, from burns, from scars, from generations of hard knowledge passed down like a sacred inheritance. Archaeological surveys of Viking Age hearth sites across Scandinavia consistently show the same materials: granite and basalt, dense, dry, collected far from water, from ancient weathered outcroppings that had already survived centuries of freeze and thaw. These stones were not simply gathered, they were tested, seasoned, and trusted. And fire? The Vikings did not see fire as a tool. They treated it as a living presence with its own language. A roaring orange flame was for the spit, aggressive, consuming. A deep, steady blue-white heat meant the stones had reached their peak, the sacred temperature where transformation happened. Pale, barely breathing embers meant cold smoking, the slow preservation of life itself. Knowing which fire you needed and how to build it was knowledge as complex as navigation. It was taught, it was inherited, and it was never taken for granted. Now here is the technique that stops people cold when they first hear it. The most powerful cooking method the Vikings possessed produced no visible flame. No smoke rising above the tree line, no sound. Nothing on the surface to suggest that anything was happening at all. Just silent earth, doing the work. The earth oven, known in archaeological literature as a cooking pit, began with excavation. A hole, oval or round, dug deep enough to hold an entire animal, if the feast demanded it. At the bottom, a thick layer of dry granite stones was carefully arranged. Then a fire was built inside the pit and fed for hours, sometimes through an entire night, until those stones glowed red. When the fire burned down, the coals were removed. And then came the layer that made everything work. Fresh, wet leaves, birch, fern, broad-leafed vegetation that contained enough moisture to generate a continuous envelope of steam inside the sealed pit. The meat, rubbed with salt, wild juniper, and herbs, was wrapped in more leaves and lowered in. The pit was sealed with earth and left alone. What emerged, hours later, was not simply cooked meat. It was something closer to a revelation. Collagen broken down into gelatin. Connective tissue dissolved. The toughest cuts of venison or mutton transformed into something that required no knife. Here is what makes this extraordinary. This same technique, hot stones, sealed pit, steam, was developed independently by the Maori of New Zealand in their hangi, by native Hawaiian cultures in their imu, and by Athabascan peoples of subarctic Alaska. Separated by oceans and centuries, human beings facing the same challenge arrived at the same answer. That is not coincidence. That is the signature of a perfect solution, and the Vikings had found it long before anyone wrote it down. The earth oven was patience made physical. It was the technique of kings and ceremonies, when time was a luxury the Vikings could afford. But a warrior returning from 3 weeks at sea does not want to wait until morning. He wants to eat, now. And for that, the Vikings had a different answer, faster, simpler, and in its own way, just as brilliant. A flat stone, wide, smooth, free of cracks, pulled from the fire at the precise moment it reached peak temperature. Not too soon, not too late. Set over a bed of glowing coals, it became something no blacksmith had yet forged. A perfect cooking surface. Salmon laid directly on that stone did not burn. The scales and skins sealed instantly against the heat, creating a natural barrier that locked every drop of fat and moisture inside. Within minutes, the skin became something extraordinary, crackling, golden, as thin and crisp as glass. Beneath it, the flesh remained barely touched. Tender, luminous, tasting of wood smoke and the sea. No modern non-stick surface replicates this. The reason is physics. Cast iron cookware, celebrated today as the gold standard of heat retention, operates on the same fundamental principle the Vikings were using 1,000 years earlier. Thermal mass. Slow, even heat release. The stone does not spike and drop like thin metal. It holds. It gives. It cooks from all directions at once. The Vikings did not know the term thermal mass, but their hands knew the feeling, and that knowledge fed generations. Flatbreads of barley and rye were thrown directly onto the same surface, puffing, blistering, done in minutes. A complete meal. No vessels, no waiting. But what if you needed to feed not one warrior, but 300? Here is a question that should be impossible to answer. How do you boil water in wood? Wood burns. Everyone knows this. A wooden trough filled with water and placed over fire becomes, very quickly, not a cooking vessel, but fuel. So the Vikings did something that sounds like a riddle and works like a miracle. They did not bring the vessel to the fire. They brought the fire to the vessel. A large hearth burned constantly near the cooking area. Smooth, fist-sized granite stones sat inside it, heating for 30 minutes or more, until they reached temperatures that made the air above them shimmer. Using long wooden tongs, the only tool that could safely bridge the gap between fire and water, a cook would lift one stone, allow the ash to fall away, and lower it hissing into a wooden trough filled with water, meat, and root vegetables. What happened next was not subtle. The water around that stone erupted. Steam billowed upward in a column. The temperature of the entire trough spiked within seconds. Then the stone cooled, its energy spent, and was lifted out, sent back to the fire to recharge, while the next red-hot stone was already descending. This was not a one-person task. It was choreography. One person managing the fire and the stones, another controlling the trough. A rhythm as precise and physical as rowing. Experimental archaeology conducted in Denmark has demonstrated that this method can bring 40 liters of water to a rolling boil in under 30 minutes, using nothing but stones and a wooden container. The same technique heated the wort for Viking ale, which means that every celebration, every toast raised in a mead hall, every story told over a warm cup, began with a stone pulled from a fire by a pair of wooden tongs. In a world without metal, fire found another way in. And when winter arrived, when the sea froze and the hunts grew sparse, the Vikings needed something more than heat. They needed time itself, bottled and sealed. Winter in Scandinavia during the Viking Age was not an inconvenience. It was a test, a long, merciless examination of every decision made during the warmer months. A failed harvest, a poor hunt, a summer spent raiding instead of storing. Any of these could mean starvation before the ice broke in spring. This is why the Vikings elevated smoking from a cooking technique into something closer to a sacred responsibility. They practiced two forms, and the difference between them was the difference between a meal and a lifeline. Hot smoking was fast. Meat or fish hung close to smoldering coals inside a sealed pit or enclosed structure. Heat and thick smoke penetrated simultaneously, cooking the flesh, coloring it a deep amber, filling it with the resinous fragrance of burning alder or juniper wood. The result was ready within hours, extraordinary to eat, but it lasted only days. Cold smoking was something else entirely. The architecture of cold smoking was ingenious in its simplicity. A fire was built at one end of a long underground trench, sometimes stretching several meters. The smoke traveled the length of that channel, losing heat as it moved, arriving at the hanging chamber cool and dense. The product, fish or meat previously soaked for days in concentrated salt brine, hung in that chamber for weeks. What happened during those weeks was not cooking. It was transformation at the molecular level. Modern food science confirms what Viking smokers understood through generations of practice. The phenolic compounds in wood smoke, particularly from alder and juniper, create an antimicrobial barrier on the surface of protein. Combined with the dehydrating effect of salt, the result is a product that resists bacterial growth for months without refrigeration. The person responsible for maintaining this process, keeping the fire alive but never letting it flare, watching the smoke density through the night, adjusting fuel to maintain the precise temperature range of roughly 15 to 25 degrees Celsius, was not a servant. They were a specialist, held in a regard that, according to some historians, approached that of a blacksmith or a skilled navigator. Because a blacksmith forged weapons for one battle, a cold smoker fed an entire village through 4 months of darkness. In a world where power was measured in what you could provide, that was its own kind of dominance. There is a structure standing in reconstructed Viking Age villages across Scandinavia today that visitors consistently mistake for something else. They think it is a kiln, a pottery workshop, something industrial. It is, in fact, a bread oven, and it is almost identical, in principle, in shape, in thermal logic, to the wood-fired pizza ovens that modern restaurants spend tens of thousands of dollars to import from Naples. The Vikings built theirs in a single day. A dome was formed from bent willow rods, flexible, lightweight, temporary. Over this frame, the builders applied layer after layer of a mixture: clay, coarse sand, and chopped straw. The straw was not decorative. It acted as a reinforcing fiber within the clay matrix, preventing cracking as the structure dried and was fired, a technique that modern materials scientists would recognize as a primitive but effective form of composite construction. Once the dome hardened, a fire was built inside. This served two purposes. It burned away the willow frame entirely, and it fired the clay from the inside out, turning the raw earth structure into something approaching ceramic. Hard, durable, capable of absorbing and holding enormous amounts of heat. The baking process itself required no active fire. Heat was loaded into the walls during a burn of several hours. Then every coal and ember was swept clean. The interior, white hot, radiating from every surface simultaneously, received the loaves. The entrance was sealed with a clay-coated wooden door. What followed was not baking in the conventional sense. It was immersion in heat. The bread did not sit above a flame. It floated inside a sphere of radiant energy, cooking from all directions at once. The crust that resulted, thick, dark, crackling, sealed everything inside. The crumb beneath was dense and moist, carrying a faint mineral warmth from the clay walls themselves. This was not luxury bread. This was engineering expressed in flour and fire. And when the loaves came out, the oven was not finished. Pots of barley porridge or root vegetable stew were placed inside the cooling chamber, cooking slowly for hours on residual heat alone. One fire, one structure, zero waste. If smoking was the Vikings' mastery of chemistry, then fermentation was their mastery of biology, and they practiced it with a sophistication that modern science is only now fully appreciating. Ale and beer were not recreational luxuries in the Viking world. They were nutritional infrastructure. The water sources available to most Viking-age settlements, rivers, shallow wells, standing pools, carried genuine microbial risk. Boiling water for drinking required fuel. Fuel required labor. Labor was always in short supply. Fermented ale, brewed at modest alcohol concentrations of roughly 2 to 4%, was safer. The boiling of wort during brewing, achieved, as we have already seen through stone heating, killed pathogens. The fermentation process itself, driven by wild yeast colonies living in the wooden walls of the brewing vats, produced an environment hostile to harmful bacteria. This was not accidental. Across generations of observation, Viking communities learned that people who drank ale stayed healthier than those who drank untreated water. They did not have the language of microbiology, but they had the evidence of survival. Fermentation also extended to food preservation in ways that challenge modern assumptions about what is edible. Fish, particularly in the northernmost regions of Scandinavia, was packed in salt and sealed in pits or wooden barrels and left to ferment for months. The process is driven by lactic acid bacteria, naturally present in the fish gut and skin. These bacteria, in the presence of salt, outcompete dangerous pathogens and break down proteins into compounds that are not only safe, but nutritionally dense. The result, pungent, intensely flavored, almost shockingly preserved, was not a delicacy born of desperation. It was a calculated biological technology, a way of turning a summer's catch into a winter's survival. The Vikings did not stumble onto fermentation. They cultivated it. They passed the knowledge of which vats produced the best ale, which fish responded best to salt ratios, which temperatures yielded the richest results, through families, through generations, through the same quiet inheritance that carried the knowledge of stones and fire. This was their biotechnology, invisible, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. Do you remember where we began? 300 warriors, a hall filled with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, and not a single metal pot anywhere in sight. Now you know what was really happening in that hall. Beneath the floor, earth ovens were still radiating heat from fires lit the night before. Along the walls, cold smokehouses had been working for weeks, sealing protein against time itself. Wooden troughs near the hearth steamed with broth brought to boil by stones pulled from the fire in a rhythm as practiced and precise as any battle formation. Clay ovens outside the longhouse were cooling slowly, bread already done, porridge finishing on residual heat alone. And in the dark corners of the storehouse, barrels of ale fermented quietly, the product of a biological process the Vikings had refined over centuries without ever knowing its name. This was not primitive survival. This was a complete system, elegant, interlocking, deeply intelligent, and it was built from nothing more than what the land provided. Here is what I want you to carry with you from this video. The Vikings did not conquer nature. They did not bend it to their will through force or technology. They did something far more difficult and far more rare. They listened to it. They listened until they understood the language of stone, until they could read fire by its color and its sound, until they knew which wood burned long and which burned fragrant, until the earth itself became an oven, and the smoke became a preservative, and the wild yeast in a wooden barrel became medicine, and nature, in return, fed them through the longest winters in the world. That is not a Viking secret. That is a human truth that most of us have simply forgotten. If this changed the way you see the ancient world, tell us in the comments. What surprised you most? The earth oven? The stone boiling? The cold smoking that kept an entire village alive through winter? And if you want to go deeper, the Athabascan people of subarctic Alaska built homes that stayed warm at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. No electricity, no insulation as we know it, just knowledge, material, and an understanding of cold that most of us cannot imagine. That story is coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.